There was a cloudy, moonless sky on this cold autumn night, the perfect night for some mischief, the perfect night for a Halloween prank. In a dimly lit shed in his parents' backyard, Dave and two of his friends were preparing for a night of trouble. "Did you bring the masks?" one of the boys asked. "Of course I did," replied Dave, producing two funhouse devil masks from a bag. "Devils for you two," he said as he handed his friends, Joseph and Mark, two grotesque masks, "and a skeleton for me." Dave slipped a crude skull mask over his head. "Now," he began, looking at Mark, "did you bring the other stuff?" "I've got it right here," Mark said, snickering. Mark reached into his jacket pocket, taking out a handful of small firecrackers. "These ought to do it." "Shit," Dave frowned. He'd hoped for more fireworks, but these would have to do. They had a terrific Halloween prank planned, and Dave knew the perfect person to play a trick on this evening. Old Man Thompson was the neighborhood grump, a codger who just didn't seem to like anyone. No one knew how old he was, but he'd been living in the shabby two-story house up on the hill for as long as anyone could remember. Dave still thought about how the curmudgeon had gotten him fired from his paper route a few summers ago, complaining that the newspapers were never on the porch but thrown into the yard haphazardly, causing them to arrive bent and creased. He couldn't believe that bastard had the gall to call up his boss and chew him out over such a minor grievance. But now the time had finally come to teach the ancient miser a lesson, one he would never forget, Dave thought to himself. Little did Dave know that what would transpire on this night would be something that he himself would never forget. It was the night before Halloween, after all, often referred to as Devil's Night. And indeed, the devil was about to play a trick, not just on Old Man Thompson, but on them all. The Devil's Tricks, a bite-sized fright. This series contains disturbing content. Listener discretion is advised. Their intended victim's house was a run-down place, Gothic in design, with arched shapes and a spire of sorts on one side, containing a single arched window. The kids around the neighborhood called it the haunted house, and the adults simply told their children not to go near it and to leave the old man alone. Those who did venture close to the house were yelled at for walking on the grass or riding their bicycles on the sidewalk too close to the grass, for making too much noise, or for simply being anywhere in the vicinity. Rumor had it that once the old man had knocked a small girl off her bicycle with his cane. Some even said he was an old war criminal, hiding out in their small town under a fake name. No one really knew for certain. Now and again the house was vandalized. The usual things: eggs smashed against windows, toilet paper strewn through trees. But Dave and his friends had something much better in store for Old Man Thompson tonight. As the night grew darker still, the trio crept through their neighborhood, making their way to the hill at the end of one long winding street where the cantankerous old coot lived. It was nearly 9 o'clock as they tiptoed up the rickety steps to his front door, being as quiet as they could. No easy task as they attempted to sneak across the rotted, creaking wood. Joseph carried a medium-sized carved jack-o'-lantern in his arms with a deformed, misshapen face. Inside the hollowed-out pumpkin lay a bundle of firecrackers. Their plan was perfect. Knock on the old man's door, frighten him with their masks, then light the pumpkin and toss it into his doorway to really get him good. The resulting chaos would be incredible, an excellent prank for Devil's Night, and where could one find a more deserving victim, Dave thought to himself. He took the lead as they reached the door. "Okay," he whispered as the other two boys leaned against the walls of the house on either side of the door. "After I knock, I'm gonna hide. When he opens the door, we jump out and scare the shit out of him." The boys nodded. "Joe, Then you light the pumpkin, throw it in, and we all run." Dave paused, adjusting his mask. He raised a closed hand, then firmly rapped on the door 3 times, scrambling behind a decrepit old wooden bench on the porch in an effort to conceal himself. The boys waited and waited. Nothing. Joseph and Mark looked at each other nervously, then at Dave. "What do we do now?" Mark hissed. "Shut up and let me think," Dave hissed back. "Come on, I've got an idea." The boys followed Dave's lead and crept around to the side of the house. Dave peered inside a nearby window. The faint glow of a television illuminated the darkness inside the old man's home. "Huh," Dave said. "He's in there, watching TV." Dave grasped the bottom window and, with a nudge, forced it slightly upwards. "It's not locked. Come on." He motioned to the other 2 as he carefully pushed the window open, just enough for the boys to climb inside the house. The interior of the house was, as you might expect, musty smelling, with old wallpaper peeling in places and a variety of knickknacks littering numerous shelves and tables. The old man sat in a chair, his back towards them, as a black and white sitcom played on the television. It seemed as if he had dozed off. Dave turned to Joseph and Mark as they softly circled around behind old man Thompson. "On 3, he whispered as quietly as he could. He held up his hand, 1 finger at first, then another, and finally a 3rd. The boys leapt into the man's den, roaring and hollering as loudly as they could, arms raised as if they were actual demons, there to devour the old man's soul. Thompson, startled awake by the sudden cacophony, gasped and yelled in panic, gripping the arm of his chair. Joseph had just begun to flick his lighter, attempting to set the firecrackers ablaze, when the old man stood up, clinging onto his cane. He swung wildly at the boys, Dave and Mark easily lunging out of the way, laughing and guffawing. In the commotion, Thompson knocked over an old lantern that the boys hadn't noticed, sitting on a side table. An oil lamp. The lantern crashed to the floor, oil and flames splashing out chaotically. The old man's legs, soaked with some of the oil, suddenly became engulfed with fire. He screamed and dropped his cane, staggering towards the boys, arms outstretched. "Oh, shit!" Joseph yelled, dropping the pumpkin and the fireworks he had just ignited. The pumpkin rolled towards the far end of the room, the fireworks popping and sizzling as it barreled across the floor. "Run!" yelled Dave, bolting for the door. Mark was close behind him, but Joseph, in his confusion, had gone the wrong way. The old man was now nearly completely immersed in flames, screaming and groaning in agony. The den was quickly becoming hotter and hotter as the fire spread and smoke began to fill the air. Joseph quickly realized that he was heading in the wrong direction, and as he turned back towards the open window, there was the old man. He stumbled towards Joseph, reaching out and grabbing for him as Joseph frantically tried to kick him away. With a desperate shove, Joseph pushed Thompson off him and scrambled out of the window through which they had entered, landing painfully with a thud in the grass outside. Dave and Mark were already down the steps, waving at him frantically. "Come on!" they both shouted. Joseph winced and picked himself up, staggering in a limping jog. With an awful wail, the burning figure of old man Thompson appeared in the doorway, one arm outstretched, reaching towards the boys. "Jesus Christ," Joseph said with a hushed breath, as the man collapsed in the doorway, a smoldering heap. The boys sped off into the night, horrified at what they'd just done. This was one devil's night that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Halloween has always been a night of tricks. From its darker roots stretching back to the pagan festival of Samhain, which we covered in a previous episode of Bite-Sized Frights, to modern-day, mostly harmless pranks played by children. fake spiders placed to startle unsuspecting victims, plastic wrap stretched over toilet seats, Vaseline on door handles. Aggravating, yes, but still in good fun. Every now and then, however, Halloween pranks go too far, as in the story you've just heard. The traditional saying heard on Halloween night, trick or treat, alludes to such practical jokes. When trick-or-treaters arrive at your door, be prepared to hand over some candy, lest you become the victim of a prank later that evening. In the early days of Halloween in North America, a tradition brought to the continent by Irish and Scottish settlers in the 1800s, tricks were far more prevalent than treats. Back in 1879, on one near-deadly Halloween night, a train was rolling along through Newport, Kentucky, when the engineer saw something so shocking that it nearly stopped his heart, a body lying on the tracks. He pulled on the brake and managed to bring the train to a grinding halt just in time before the person on the tracks was obliterated by the locomotive. The engineer leapt out of the train, then realized why the person was lying so lifelessly still on the railroad tracks. It was a stuffed figure, placed there as a Halloween prank by a large group of boys who were hiding nearby, who began cackling with glee at their successful trick. The engineer reportedly uttered no cross words to the boys, despite their prank putting both his life and the passengers' lives in jeopardy. It reminded him of similar tricks he had played as a boy. Back then, Halloween was indeed full of pranks, and even destruction and violence. Tricks from the old country included carving faces in turnips, not to necessarily scare away evil spirits, but to frighten unsuspecting travelers, or tying rope around cabbages and pulling them through fields so they appeared to move on their own, scaring anyone who came across them. In Scotland, one particularly foul prank involved setting fire to a cabbage stalk, then placing it near the keyhole of someone's door, allowing the noxious fumes to pervade the house, and leaving an unpleasant surprise for the owner. Harmless enough, if not incredibly annoying. In America, throughout the 1800s, pranks continued to be played on Halloween. The wagons and livestock of farmers would be hoisted up onto the farmers' roofs, and sometimes vegetables would be torn out of the ground and outhouses tipped over, often while occupied. In some areas, gates were ripped right off fences or simply removed from their hinges. Sometimes they were merely opened so that animals could escape. This led to Halloween being referred to as Gate Night for some time. In 1902, with the community of Arlington Heights, Illinois, fed up with the annual tradition of pranks on this ghoulish holiday, the local newspaper published an article encouraging residents to load muskets or cannons with rock, salt, or birdshot, and pepper any trespassers who seemed to be up to no good on Halloween night, hopefully curing them of their taste for such wicked tricks. In 1907, a trickster met an untimely end in Tucson, Arizona, when a pedestrian tripped on a wire that pranksters had stretched across a sidewalk. The victim of the prank fell to the ground, then drew a revolver, shooting one of the jokesters dead. That same year, a woman in Indiana was literally scared to death by a group of young boys. The woman's daughter heard a knock at their door, and when she opened it, the boys shoved a gruesome, grinning jack-o'-lantern in her face. The girl screamed, causing the mother's heart to suddenly stop. She collapsed on the floor, dead. With the invention of the automobile, pranks began to evolve, particularly in cities. Manhole covers would often be removed, damaging passing cars, and tires would be deflated, leaving motorists stranded. Pranksters even went as far as to construct fake road signs designed to confuse motorists. Tricks also began to turn even more destructive, with children setting fires, breaking windows, and tripping or knocking down pedestrians, all in the name of Halloween mischief. Victims would sometimes be assaulted on the streets, doused with bags of flour, or with stockings filled with ashes. On Halloween night in 1918, in Kansas City, there was a particularly dangerous prank in which 9 boys waxed streetcar tracks with candles, causing a streetcar to slip on a steep hill, crashing into 2 other cars and causing near-fatal injuries to the female conductor of one of the cars. The boys were eventually prosecuted for their crimes. With the onset of the Great Depression in America, pranks became more violent still and were often accompanied by looting, leading some cities to consider banning Halloween by 1933. Communities and neighborhood organizations began to plan parties, festivals, and costume parades in an attempt to curtail the wanton destruction and keep the kids out of trouble. This eventually led to the concept of modern-day trick-or-treating, a huge part of American culture, although the violent tricks would not disappear entirely. In some regions, the pernicious pranks simply moved to the night before Halloween, October the 30th. Depending on where you lived, it became known as Mischief Night, Goosey Night, or even Cabbage Night, a reference to old Scottish traditions. In some areas, it is known by a more sinister-sounding name, Devil's Night. Most pranks usually involved only minor vandalism: toilet paper strung over trees and bushes, eggs thrown at houses, and shoe polish spread all over car windows. However, the frequency of destructive tricks was by no means diminished. In Detroit and other cities throughout Michigan in the 1970s and 80s, arsonists set fire to trash cans, dumpsters, and abandoned buildings, truly heeding the name Devil's Night, perhaps. In 1984, more than 800 fires were set across Detroit during a 3-night reign of destruction, causing the city to institute curfews for those under the age of 18 and organize numerous city watches. Over the years, other serious crimes have been committed in the name of sick Halloween jokes, such as in 1964, when a New York woman named Helen File handed out household items including ant poison and dog treats to children on Halloween night. When questioned by police, the woman said that she only gave the questionable items to kids she thought were too old to be trick-or-treating. Fortunately enough, no children fell ill due to her actions. One of the most infamous cases in the history of Halloween occurred in 1974, when a Texas man named Ronald O'Brien passed out cyanide-laced pixie sticks to his children, as well as several of their young friends. None of the children except for his son ate the candy. The latter tragically died shortly thereafter. Investigators could not prove that O'Brien had laced the candy with cyanide himself, but they discovered that he had recently taken out life insurance policies on his children. He was convicted of murder and executed in 1984. Parents have been worried about poisoned candy for generations, and although incidents like this one only increased that fear, in O'Brien's case, he specifically targeted his children and their friends, not random neighborhood kids out for tricks or treats. Still, this is a highly disturbing and sad case, a perfect example of Halloween customs being corrupted and used for dastardly ends. In truth, cases of poisoned candy and blades, pins, or needles hidden inside snacks and treats are extremely rare. The stories are hard to stop once they spread, however, and over time, they've become a frightening Halloween myth all unto themselves. In the 1981 horror movie sequel Halloween 2, which takes place on October the 31st, like its 1978 predecessor, a child is seen visiting the hospital with a razor blade stuck in his mouth, a clear reference to the urban legend of tainted Halloween treats. This legend has its roots in several notorious real-life Halloween pranks of the deadly variety. As pointed out in the 2007 film Trick or Treat, according to the rules of Halloween, it is always a good idea to check your candy. What do you think? Are Halloween tricks an integral part of the season, or should they be consigned to being merely relics of a more primitive and cruel past? Should modern-day celebrations involve purely fun, frolic and light-hearted frights. Perhaps a little terror never hurt anyone. After all, it is Halloween, and everyone deserves at least one good scare. We would love to hear your own thoughts and ideas about these sinister stories and terrifying traditions. If you have enjoyed this episode, please follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Pixel Elixir, and on Instagram at Bite-Sized Frights. You can also subscribe at bitesizedfrights.com so that you never miss any of our terrifying tales. This has been a Pixel Elixir production, narrated by Chris K. Thank you for listening. Until the next bite, my friends, and happy Halloween.